but still the branches are wire and thunders the pounding mortar. Still I close my eyes and see the girl running from her village, napalm stuck to her dress like jelly, her hands reaching for the no one who waits in waves of heat before her.
These verses established the reputation of a prominent poet in modern American literature. He was in the military from 1967 to 1968, fighting in the Vietnam War. He is a gifted poet as well as a university professor. He broke down in tears as he read the handwritten verses of Vietnamese soldiers that the Americans had gathered and preserved for years, verses that express love and no shred of hostility. Bruce Weigl turned to poetry to mend his soul and to relieve the war wounds he felt responsible for inflicting on a nation thousands of miles away.
Yes, so the man you just saw from the clip did cry over Vietnamese poems written by Vietnamese soldiers found on captured documents after the American War many years. And that incident profoundly changed him and making him from a yet veteran, U.S. veteran to an ambassador of the Vietnamese and American literature, connecting souls between the two countries. And during that journey, he also found his Vietnamese soul. So we are very honored to have Professor and poet Bruce Weigl here today on Talk Vietnam for the very first time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Happy to be here.
Yeah. So how are you, Bruce?
I'm well, thank you.
Yeah. How's your trip to Vietnam?
I always feel best when I'm here. I love my time here, especially in Hanoi.
Well, we just saw the clip of you, and we can see that you were very emotional when you read the poems by the Vietnamese soldiers.
Yeah.
Yeah. So could you explain to us what triggered so much emotion from you?
Yeah, I wasn't expecting to see poetry. I was told about this archive, and I knew where it had come from because I knew that whenever enemy soldiers were captured or killed or wounded, one of the things that all soldiers were instructed to do was to take all the paper off of them in case there would be something with military value. So I was interested in seeing this microfilm of these documents, and a young woman who was working at the William Joyner Center, Nguyen Thanh, invited me. So we were looking through the microfilm, and I noticed what looked like short poems. So I asked her what they were, and these are from the diaries of the soldiers. And she said that they were poems, and I was mystified. I said, why would there be poems here? And she said, because they wrote them because they missed their families and they were lonely for their loved ones. And as soon as she said that, I was struck for the first time with this really profound sense that the people that I had fought against were very much like myself and my fellow soldiers as young men fighting in a war that maybe we didn't really understand. We spent about an hour literally translating one of the poems, and it was beautiful and touching and sweet.
So were you surprised that what you found in those diaries many poems? And is it normal?
Yeah, I was completely surprised. I never expected to find poetry because I think I was thinking of myself and my fellow soldiers, and poetry was never a topic of our discussion. We didn't write poetry, we didn't read poetry. I like to say that the Vietnamese soldiers had poetry and the American soldiers had Playboy. So I was surprised, but once I began to learn more about the culture and understand the place that poetry has had in the culture for many centuries, then it made sense to me that they would express themselves this way. More surprising, though, to me was how good they were. Because remember, for the most part, these were not professionally trained, educated poets. These were soldiers writing from their heart. And sometimes that can be moving, but the poetry isn't very good. But in most of these cases, the poetry there was a purity to it, a clarity to it that was very moving and engaging.
It took Bruce Weigl almost 6 years to translate a relatively short poetry collection into English. Those poems, while seemingly simple, embodied the soul of the Liberation Army soldiers. It could be a father's confidant message to his young children in the poem Voice of the Lullaby, or the word of praise for his birthplace from a son who fought far away from home in the poem My Birthplace, Nam Định, or the secret love of the young man in the prime of his life in the poem Meeting. 23 poems tell 23 stories, 23 vivid pictures of people who once stood on the front lines to fight against Bruce Weigl and the U.S. Army.
Cái buổi ra mắt sách ở Đại học Massachusetts, tôi đã được thay mặt những người Việt Nam để bày tỏ lòng biết ơn của tôi đối với những người đã dịch tập thơ đó, đã phát hiện tập thơ đó. Họ dịch tập thơ đó ra để minh chứng cho người Mỹ rằng thơ ca là một cái hồ sơ quan trọng nhất, chính xác nhất để nói về tâm hồn hay bên trong của một con người.
Not only was it warmly received by readers, but the poems also received many positive reviews from critics.
The greatest strength of this book lies in its historical significance. The poems offer fresh insight into the emotional life of the Vietnamese soldier previously unavailable in translation. I highly recommend these translations. Done with grace and skill, they will be useful in courses on war.
The popularity of the poetry book allows Bruce Weigl to expand his literary work in a new direction. He has also taken on the responsibility of translating other poetry by Vietnamese writers to make it available to readers worldwide.
So it took you 6 years to translate all of those poems, right? Tell us more about that process.
When I began, I knew hardly any Vietnamese at all. So I had to start at a really fundamental level just so I could understand the grammar and the pronouns. And then I had to learn the tones. And then I began to try to build my vocabulary. But mostly it had to do with literature. So it was a limited vocabulary. So that took several years.
Right.
After about 4 years, we had a draft of this manuscript that I thought was pretty good and that I knew would be interesting to people. Small audience, but a high interest. I've published, I think, around 35 books. And it's, I think, the project that I'm most proud of in all my writing life, this book.
Now I want to ask you about the reactions from the American readers when they read the Vietnamese poems translated into English.
Yeah, it's also an interesting question because there's been an evolution. When I first began to work on poems from captured documents, and I began to send, individual poems out to magazines for publication, I received some unfriendly letters. And they accused me of being disloyal to my fellow soldiers because I was helping translate the poems of the enemy. This didn't surprise me. And it didn't really bother me. I didn't really care that much. In each case, if I had the opportunity, I reached out to those people and tried to explain to them why the work that I was doing, why I thought the work that I was doing was important, not just to me, but to them too. Most of the people who wrote these letters were veterans. By
So
the
they
time
still had a lot of hatred towards...
That's right.
Yeah.
That's exactly what it has to do with. Yeah, nothing more than that. Not a hatred of Vietnamese, not a hatred of Vietnamese poetry or the poetry of soldiers, but this sort of blind patriotism, that this blind loyalty to an ideal.
Right.
By the time the second book came along, the American attitude toward the Vietnamese had begun to change. When more books and movies about Vietnam began to appear, more Americans were open to hearing the truth. You know, by the time I had published an anthology with some of my colleagues that included the poems of many communist writers, it wasn't even an issue any longer. It was more, this is not communist literature, this is Vietnamese literature.
13 poetry collections is a remarkable achievement that shows the creative power of Bruce Weigl. Although he writes about many rich topics about life, wars, especially the Vietnam War, have always been an endless source of inspiration for Bruce Weigl's poems. He revisited the memories of the years fighting in Vietnam with these anxious verses.
Nothing can change that. She's burned behind my eyes, and not your good love, and not the rain-swept air, and not the jungle green pasture unfolding before us can deny it.
Besides numerous poetry awards and honors, Bruce Weigl has been nominated twice for the prestigious Pulitzer Prize, first in 1988 for his poetry collection Song of Napalm, and in 2013 with the poetry collection The Abundance of Nothing. Bruce Weigl's latest collection of poems, Among Elms in Ambush, tells his emotions with modern and global themes, but still subtly shows the thoughts of a person haunted by the past.
You said that war broke your life, but somehow it gave you your voice. So can you elaborate more on that?
War is something that rewires your brain. Trauma, we know, is something that rewires your brain. We know now, after many years of therapy and medication and electroshock and many different kinds of treatment, we know now that when this kind of change occurs, it doesn't change back.
Okay.
It stays that way.
It's like Agent Orange.
Yeah, this is what PTSD is, and post-traumatic stress disorder. This can come from a shooting, a robbery, a rape, abuse, any kind of trauma. The brain assumes a very primitive role, which is called fight or flight.
Okay.
So you either have to stand there and fight, or you have to run away. That's the most primitive instinct that we have as human beings, as biological creatures.
Right.
So most of us who fought in the American war in Vietnam spent a lot of time believing that it would be possible to erase that, or to go back to the way we were before those events in the war. And it took a long time to accept the fact, and then to learn to live with the fact that that wasn't true. I think that I was more fortunate than most people because I had a more intimate relationship with Vietnam. And this helped me deal with my own grief about the war. But that biological thing, that neurochemical thing is still there. If someone dropped something heavy on the floor behind me, you would see me jump out of the chair still.
Even now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or if a helicopter flew low in the sky, I would look up very quickly. Those kinds of things. I still have dreams that are related to my experience in the war. Having spent so much time trying to solve some of those problems as a writer has helped me as a man, as a person. And I'm not saying that I have all the answers, but I'm saying that I see things much more clearly now than I did when I began this process, right after I was a soldier, and certainly more clearly than I did when I was a soldier.
How did poetry help you to close the wounds from war?
I can use a story from the Dharma to answer that question. If as a person we feel anger or resentment or hatred to someone, it's sometimes hard to get rid of that. But the Dharma teaches us that if we practice compassion by watering our garden every day, And as we water our garden, we imagine that we're watering the compassion inside of us. And soon, if we do that long enough, there's no more room for the anger or the hatred or the resentment. There's just the compassion inside. And I think that poetry works the same way, that it comes inside and takes up a lot of room. So maybe there's a little room for those other things, those nightmares, not as much. And instead, there's more room to celebrate joy. Even though the Song of Napalm is a sad poem, it's a positive gesture because it's the victims taking charge and telling their story, and not having historian or the journalist, telling it.
Yeah.
Every time Bruce Weigl returns, he spends a lot of time immersing himself in Vietnamese life. Despite the differences in language and culture, anyone who has met Bruce detects a Vietnamese essence in his African poet's soul. Very few people know that Bruce has a special love for Vietnamese fish sauce. He has even tried distilling it himself at his home in Ohio.
Và một trong những ước mơ lớn nhất của ông trong cuối đời là ông được nằm xuống vĩnh viễn trên mảnh đất này, và ông không muốn nằm ở đâu khác ngoài ở đất nước này. Ông nghĩ rằng ông mắc nợ với dân tộc này. Ông muốn làm một việc dù rất nhỏ cho một người Việt Nam nào đó để có thể giải tỏa đi một phần cái nặng nề trong tâm hồn mình.
The way Bruce paid his debt and forged a deep connection with Vietnam was to adopt a Vietnamese child. Nguyễn Thị Hạnh was adopted by Bruce and taken to live in the US in 1994. Bruce did everything to help his adopted daughter retain her Vietnamese heritage.
So my dad kept the Vietnamese culture in me by going out of his way, finding friends and teachers to surround me. Even though they were quite older than me, he wanted to make sure that I kept my roots. Even there were a period in my life, my teenage years, I didn't want to keep. There was a time where I did resent him. I am very, very thankful now that he pushed through because he knew it was part of who I am, and he kept it from me. And for that, I am forever thankful to my father.
During her adult years, with the encouragement of her adoptive parents, Hạnh returned to Vietnam many times to maintain a connection with where she was born. The most difficult but meaningful thing that Hạnh ever did was translate her adoptive father's memoir, The Circle of Hạnh, into Vietnamese. That is Hạnh way of paying back Bruce Weigl for the years he devotedly tried to preserve her Vietnamese roots.
Now tell us about your first time visited Vietnam after the war.
After the war. I was teaching at a university and working on a magazine in New York called Intervention. It was a political magazine whose editorial philosophy was anti-interventionist politics. The founder of the magazine was a Marine Corps veteran who lost a leg to combat in Vietnam. He was a brilliant man. He's now dead. He was a brilliant man, and he loved the Vietnamese people and loved the revolution and supported the revolution long before it was popular in America. I joined him working on this magazine, spending time in New York. We would spend 3 or 4 days together, putting a whole issue together, staying up all night, no money. But as a result of the magazine, he was invited to East Germany to a conference that the then East Germans were holding as a forum to discuss the American war in Vietnam. And they brought to Germany a retired North Vietnamese general and my friend Tom Nussbaumer, the editor of the magazine. During that official interaction, my friend Tom and this retired general became very good friends, very close.
So from two enemies to two good friends.
Yeah. And after a year or so, the general invited Tom to come to Hanoi and invited him to bring 2 American friends. So I was one of the 2 friends that he asked. He was ill and wasn't able to make the trip. So 2 other friends went, but we did go. And we were hosted by the general. And we all loved him like a father when we left. He was so great. Hanoi was difficult in those days, 1986. You have to imagine that the city was completely dark. The shops were empty. There were no hotels for foreigners. We had to stay in a guest house, a beautiful place on Nguyen Du that the French built. We were among the earliest visitors from America after the war. We were able to get around and walk around the city eventually and spend time talking with people. And then we traveled south to Ho Chi Minh City with the general. And so it was an amazing, amazing trip. And as soon as I left, I realized that I wanted to come back. So I came back in 1990, and this is after Open Door, and things were very, very different. Things were open. We could go into people's homes without any problem.
Yeah. So during that first trip, did you? How did it change you? The experience from that very first trip.
Yeah, for the first time, I began to think about Vietnam as a country instead of as a war. One image was replaced with another.
Right.
So when I went home, I didn't think about bombs or guns or explosions, or I thought about children playing happily in the streets and the sky not black from the helicopters, but clear and blue.
So that's why you want to come back right after that very first trip.
And I also found, you know, there's no explaining humans' connection to place, I believe. And it doesn't matter if it's not even your place. Sometimes we go to certain places and we feel some kind of deep connection. I don't know why. I don't think anyone knows why. But that's what I felt when I came to Vietnam. In 1967, I felt that. Even in the war, I felt that. I felt somehow I was supposed to be here. And the more I've come, the more I've felt that. Till now, I really want to spend the rest of my life living half of my life here.
Yeah. So maybe that's destiny then.
Yeah, thank you.
Chói chang chưa nắng.
Because Vietnamese literature has such a hold on Bruce Weigl,
Scorching
he has a
sunlight,
lot of affection for
burn
his
the
fellow
air
writers
like
from
kiln
Vietnam.
fire.
He's often seen at many Vietnamese-American literary exchange events and also participates in training and inspiring young writers.
You made friends with so many Vietnamese writers and poets, right?
Yes.
Tell us more about the friendship that you had with them.
So I had access to Vietnamese writers because I had a connection with the Vietnam Writers Association through my work with the William Joyner Center that I spoke about earlier. We don't have in America a Writers Association the same way. The center of creative writing in America is in the university or in the college, which is probably not a good idea, but that's the way it is. Here, if you learn about the Writers Association, it's the best opportunity to meet a lot of writers, and not just members of the Writers Association, but a lot of writers in general. My oldest friend is Quang Thio. I've known him for over 30 years and worked with him for that long.
Nguyễn Quang Thiều.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And almost as long, I've known Nguyen Quinn, who is a businessman, but who's also a wonderful poet and comes from a family of well-known poets in Vietnam. I lost, not long ago, a really good friend, poet named Pham Thien Duat, who's one of my very favorite poets in Vietnam, and was a great friend. In the South, I really love the work and know very well the poet Bruce Huy, the designer and poet and translator.
Right.
Trần Văn Khoa, I've known for a long time and
Trần Văn Khoa.
And close to his work. So there's too many to remember.
Right. But there's one very special poet. His name is Trung Trung Đình.
He's a fiction writer, not a poet.
Ah, okay.
So that's why I didn't mention him. If you would have said writer, the first name I would have said was Trần Văn Đình. So I was in an office one day in the publishing house at Hội Nhà. And I was trying to pick up on the conversation in Vietnamese. And I realized that this man was talking about ăn kê. So I started paying closer attention because I had been in ăn kê. It was a very bad place to be.
So it was the hotspot of the...
Hotspot, yeah. We never owned it. We only thought we did. We were always surrounded, always. They could fire on us whenever they wanted, and often did. I was happy to leave there. So I asked him through the interpreter if he had if he was at ăn kê during the war, and he said yes. And I asked him what he did, and he told me he was a regular soldier, and that he had walked basically across the entire country to get there from the north. And I asked him what year he was there, what years, and he said 1967, 1968, which was the same years that I was there. So I said, what month were you there? And he said, he told me the month. December is the month he mentioned. We'll celebrate New Year's and Christmas, and as soon as the dark came, we were fiercely attacked from all sides. I asked Trần Văn Đình if he remembered that night, and he said, yes, of course. He remembers clearly. He said, we could see you. We could see you. And I was so moved by that, you know. So we were very close to each other that night, fighting against each other. And, you know, my first feeling was, I'm so glad that you didn't kill me. And I'm so glad I didn't kill you. And he's a very wonderful writer and a very sweet man. And I make sure that I spend time with him every time I come to Vietnam.
What a story.
After the success of the poem collection from captured documents, Bruce Weigl and his partners at the William Joyner Center began to work tirelessly on their translation. At first, he translated war memoirs such as The Mountain River, poetry from the Vietnam Wars. Over time, when he left war memoirs behind, Bruce Weigl began searching for poems with more peaceful themes to introduce a different aspect of Vietnamese literature to American readers.
Thì ông là một dịch giả xuất sắc. Chẳng hạn như tôi dịch một cái thơ thiền khoảng chừng độ 4-5 câu hoặc là 6-7 câu, thì ông chỉ sửa 1-2 chữ trong đó thôi, thì cái bài thơ khác hẳn. Thì nên là ông là một người rất là tinh tế trong cái cách dùng văn của ông.
Giáo sư Bruce Weigl chính là một trong những sứ giả rất là quan trọng của văn học Việt Nam, và ông ấy vừa chia sẻ với mình là bây giờ ông ấy nghỉ hưu rồi, thì mỗi năm ông ấy dành ít nhất là 6 tháng ở Việt Nam để dịch văn học Việt Nam, và hiện nay ông ấy đang rất là tích cực dịch những cái tác phẩm thơ mới để đưa nhiều hơn thi ca Việt Nam đến với độc giả quốc tế.
The Beginning of Water by poet Trần Lê Khanh and The Secret of Hoa Sen by poet Nguyễn Phan Quế Mai are the latest works completed by Bruce Weigl. He is working hard to finish translating Trần Lê Khang's new collection and Nguyễn Quang Thieu's epic into English.
Hành trình đó là hành trình chia sẻ thi ca, và hành trình nó rất là thăng hoa. Và khi mà cái người mà dịch giả với mình đó, họ đồng cảm được bài thơ đó, thì nó điều tuyệt vời. Có một số bài á, dịch qua tiếng Anh xong, thì tôi thấy rằng là rõ ràng á, vì không tìm được cái từ phù hợp với tiếng Việt, thì khi mà dịch qua tiếng Anh thì ông lại đưa cái từ tiếng Anh nó quá hay đi. Thì tôi cảm nhận là rõ ràng á, cái tiếng Anh nó quá hay như vậy, thì tôi lại chỉnh lại cái ngữ cảnh tiếng Việt một chút nữa để cho nó có thể nó hay hơn trong bài thơ của mình.
Bruce Weigl's next big work will be a novel, not a poetry collection as usual. It is a project that he has cherished for a long time, focusing entirely on depicting Vietnamese life and people.
Why do you want to become a bridge connecting Vietnamese authors and American authors?
Because we need to understand in this world that we're all the same, that we're all deeply connected. This is the way of the Dharma, that we're no different from each other. We're no better and we're no worse than anyone else. And that sameness is what we should celebrate. The way in which we're all the same should be a joyful idea. So anything that we can do internationally, that way. You know, I often talk about how the children of mixed-raced couples are almost always very beautiful.
Okay.
Why?
Because they get the best from
Yeah, they get the
worlds?
best. Oh, yeah. Or another way of thinking about it is because it was meant to be that way. That we are supposed to live that way together, to share. That we're not supposed to have this block over here called Vietnam and this block over here and keep a vast ocean between us and keep us separate with wars and everything else. We're supposed to do this.
right.
Literature is a very effective bridge for doing that, for bringing intimate feelings to intimate expectations.
So what is your hope for future cooperation between the two sides?
The most important thing we have to focus on now is making sure that we train young translators. So I'd like to become involved more in those efforts, both here and in the United States. I'm not sure how much more I'll do as a literary translator. It takes an enormous amount of time. It takes more time to translate a poem than it does for me to write a poem. Because there's many, many drafts, 10, 15 times over. So if you think about 75 poems, 20 times over, you understand how much time it takes.
Yeah.
You know, also to do whatever I can to draw attention to Vietnamese literature that I learn about emerging now by the young writers. It's important to pay attention to both sides of that continuum. Those that establish the tradition and those that maybe want to bump their heads against the tradition. There's value in both of those and in between too.
Yeah. So what do you think about the role of Vietnamese literature now? Is it getting more and more important in the global context?
Yeah, because it's more widely translated and because there are more than a few Vietnamese American writers writing, even though they're writing in English, they're writing about Vietnamese subjects and themes. So just like the Vietnamese population has become a natural part of the American community, Vietnamese literature is becoming a natural part of the literary community as well. These people are, it's not that only these people are a part of who we are, their literature is becoming more a part of who we are. That's a natural process. It takes a long time for that to happen. You know, first you have to shake hands, first you have to be friends. And then many, many years later, you begin to understand each other's most intimate thoughts and most private thoughts, like we find in poetry.
Right, right. And we need people like an accelerator for that very first handshaking, and then things will go from there.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Yeah, we need
like
people
you.
who are willing to live in poverty as translators.
You've been to Vietnam so many times, interacting with Vietnamese authors. Do you feel like you become more Vietnamese after all of these experience?
You know, I don't know if I become more Vietnamese or if I are more recognizing that I probably was Vietnamese. It's that connection to the place that I'm talking about. It just, when I'm walking down the street here, I just feel very comfortable. I feel like I'm supposed to be here. And that's a mystery.
What is your message to the audience out there about your journey, about your view on the legacy of war, about issues like peace and war? What is the message you want to send out to the people?
That's a lot to ask for. To ask for legacies is a lot to ask for. Certainly the first one is that war is never the answer. And the only way to conquer poverty, tragedy, sorrow, loss, all those things is with love. Paradoxically, the war helped me understand that. And especially the Vietnamese helped me understand that. The way in which Americans who fought in the war were welcomed back into the country was miraculous to us. And if that wasn't a lesson, then there is no such thing as a lesson in terms of how it's love that conquers these horrible memories. That's a pretty good lesson too, to have.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Bruce Weigl, for your sharing today. And I hope that you, the audience out there, also enjoyed our talk today and have important takeaways, which is love and soul-to-soul connection are key elements to help bridge the gap, close the misunderstanding of any nations and conflict. And that's it for our program today. We hope to see you next time. Goodbye.